Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Some of the registration shows that this is a truly global event. My name is Cindy Seaton-Rogers. I'm the Academic and Outreach Events Manager at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UT Dallas. And I want to welcome everyone for joining us today. Before we do jump into the event, I just want to go over a couple of quick items. You're all muted right now. I would like for everyone to please stay muted. And also, if you don't mind, stop sharing your video so we can maximize the bandwidth and video feed for the presenters. We will be having a question and answer at the end of the event, but please feel free to type in your questions as they come to you in the chat box, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the workshop. So first, I want to introduce Dr. Niels Romer, who's the interim dean of the School of the Arts and Humanities, the director of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, and the Stan and Barbara Raven Professor of Holocaust Studies here at UT Dallas. He received in 1993 his MA from the University of Hamburg, and in 2000 his PhD from Columbia University. He has published numerous articles, books, and several co-edited volumes, and is also the co-editor of the Germanic Review. His special fields of interest are the Holocaust, human rights, and German and Jewish cultural and intellectual history. And so now I will ask him to unmute and present for us.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for helping to organize this and also for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. This has been one of the many newer traditions that by now I think is in its fourth year, if I'm not mistaken, meaning these informal workshops on race and racism. They were initially designed as a way of bringing people from different disciplines together, because there are many of us who are interested in the study of racism, but respectively, some of us might be in German studies, some of us might be in Latin American studies, others in American studies. And there was a sense that we needed to have opportunities to come together and talk to each other across these disciplines, but also across the chronology. Alongside with it, there was another overarching interest, and I just mentioned it already earlier when we were already kind of gathering here a little bit, and that is that increasingly, it seems to me, the history of racism and the history of anti-Semitism have diverted path, so much so that there are two very distinct fields that have very little in common and overlap only here and there at times, which I think is quite unfortunate, because in the end, we all know when it comes to the history of racism, that racism and anti-Semitism originated in similar ways. There were lots of ways close bedfellows of each other in the kind of fantasies of 18th century laboratories of the world and of its people as the Enlighteners started to construct it. So various reasons, therefore, we think that also these days there's more need in terms of talking across these disciplines between the study of anti-Semitism and the study of racism. Because nowadays it almost seems as if on some level anti-Semitism gets recast as a form of hatred that is not racial. And that obviously is, to any student of the Holocaust, something that is almost impossible to fathom or to really understand. Give you just one, not too distant example of an anti-racist demonstration in Paris in June, where the demonstrators slurred anti-Semitic verbiage at the counter demonstrators. This was in Paris, so anti-racist demonstration that turned itself anti-Semitic. So where in lots of ways, therefore, these things don't seem to kind of line up any longer in the ways in which maybe they're used to have, and where there's, I think, a growing confusion, and also on the other side, a growing need to kind of come together again, also on the level of teaching. And I'm glad that later we're going to hear also a little bit more about this kind of increasing challenge now of talking in schools, in American schools, about racism and anti-Semitism. But I'm overall only here, so to speak, to welcome you all, and therefore it's my great pleasure now to hand you over to the organizer of this event, Dr. Pedro Gonzalez, who has worked quite hard to bring all of us here together, and is one of our very talented visiting assistant professors who's helped a great deal to broaden also, respectively, the offerings of the Ackerman Center in the last year and a half, and has also facilitated a great many new connections and has allowed us to make many new friends. Some of them actually are here today. So I'll hand over now to Dr. Gonzalez, and I will mute myself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Romer. I always appreciate your support in this type of event. It is a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I just wanted to make a footnote. I had the pleasure to meet Katia Gibel and Amy Ellman while in Oxford attending the ISGAP's Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism during the summer of 2018. I have a presentation that I want to share with you. So, and I just met Nafras Freddy via email, which has been wonderful. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you working together. This presentation, I need to start sharing. So, Cindy, would you mind?
I've just made you the host, so you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, I just saw the, all right. Okay, all right. So thinking about your backgrounds, I wanted to discuss the idea of race from a multi-dimensional perspective, seen from different geographies. And the first thing that came to my mind was this picture. This is at the Museum of El Amparo in Puebla. It is a timeline, an illustration that shows where Mexico and its development was during more than 2 millennia. It gives a perspective of the country in reference to the world. Normally, Mexico does not appear in such history. So I wanted to introduce today's topic by weaving together a fabric that includes symbolically one thread from the exterior and one from the interior, meaning Mexico. Both lead to the same problem observed under the topics of the idea of race. However, one of the main problems is that speaking and reading of contemporary Mexico, I have detected a pattern. Mexico and modernity are words that do not belong together. The foreign gaze cannot process well images such as this. Those are affluent neighborhoods in Mexico City, but we can find a number of examples representing modernity. So I included Santa Fe, Polanco, the surroundings of the Museum Sumaya in Mexico City. The common response to such expressions of modernity is that those places are superficial, artificial, flashy, non-authentic, or simply out of place. And that reminds me of the words of Homi Bhabha when he says that these are attempts of mimicry. They are recognizable, almost the same, but not quite the same. So that also reminds me of the Chinelo tradition in Mexico, which is a carnival expression in which indigenous people dress as Spaniards, and they somehow mock the traditions, but at the same time they are already acknowledging that those traditions are rooted within Mexican culture. So on the other hand, if I show images such as this one, there is no problem. Everyone is in agreement. This is very Mexican, even when these are Cortez's properties. One, the Palace of Cortez in Cuernavaca, built in 1526. Another one could be the National Palace, that became to look like a palace in 1562. It was another of Cortez's properties. And finally, the School of Mining, built in 1797, Alexander von Humboldt was really impressed by the premises, but more than anything, he was impressed by what was happening inside, which was the development of science, physics, biology, math, geography. So to me, these both cases coincide on one point in opinion, that colonial is Mexico. Now, these images represent a process of globality in the making. However, just like Charles Small argues in his introductory essay, Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity, more than equalizing, globality is also a way to enforce disparity. That is to say that globalization can mean progressive and special segregation, as well as separation and exclusion. The foreign and the internal gaze, forging the same image, coincide also on the topic of authenticity. The real Mexico is always indigenous, even if it is only at a folkloric level. So what I understand here by folklore is some kind of acceptable, sanitized indigenous rooting in culture. No one questions this as a true Mexicanity. The Mexican national being incarnated in the mestizo. And the mestizo is a person of mixed biological and cultural heritage, the child of a Spaniard and one indigenous woman, also considers the indigenous as authentic, although only as a remote component of the Mexican past. For the Mexican gaze, progress and modernity represent the aspirational, the goal, the true achievement, even if it's not accessible to all in the country. It creates difference, a desired extinction. Regardless of how long Mexicans have been speaking a global language, they appear to themselves and the rest of the world just like Neri Vela. Neri Vela is the astronaut that you can see wearing a big hat. So even when this global language has been spoken in Mexico since the Hernan Cortes and those palaces were built, regardless of the literary, artistic, scientific production, it seems like we always go back to picturing ourselves not only from the internal perspective, from the exterior perspective, as this astronaut wearing that sombrero and the jorongo and all that very Mexican paraphernalia. So maybe you're saying, yes, but that's too abstract. Nobody really pays attention to it. We're happy with it. That's what we know. So I wanted to give you the two examples. First, in the early 2000s, a group of young ñoños from the state of Hidalgo decided that in order to avoid mockery and bullying by mestizos, they would just stop speaking in their own language. They would also stop dressing as their parents. So they became emos. Emos is some kind of a variation from northern tribe associated with what we in Spanish call the darks or punks. So they altogether skipped the process of becoming a mestizo, which is an acceptable way of being Mexican. And that created a problem, an issue with their language, because now it's in danger of disappearing, just like many other indigenous languages. But the root problem here is the idea of race and how that affects these indigenous communities. Another case involves a simple walk through a neighborhood in the city of Cuernavaca in Mexico. This really soon became a dangerous practice when an Orthodox Jewish family was attacked by a group of juveniles who threw eggs and trash at them. I don't have the actual picture of the event, and as a matter of fact, the person who told me about this requested that I did not mention the name of the Jewish community, so I'm not gonna be able to do it, but I just wanted to create a precedent for the conversation. The problem is not that the occurrences per se and the way in which they take place. The challenge always resides in the excuses to elaborate a defense based on a discourse built on codependence within the scaffolding of race. To be clear, any talk about anti-Semitism, in Mexico at least, will conclude with the deadlock of imperialism, oppression, and lack of nationalism, all of those traits associated with Jewish Mexican people. On the other hand, the conversation about race in Mexico, when it happens, and it is not denied as a problem of classism, implies always a displacement, a hijacking, an inversion of values that, in accord with a large idea of race, always victimize once more those who become gears in the technological devices of race. And by technological devices of race, I mean deeply rooted social practices that kicked in almost automatically without anyone thinking about discrimination or their actions or responsibility towards the other, the different. That said, all linked together, these are just some vernacular expressions of a global idea of race. The foreign and the internal perspective seem to overlap when they both behave in adscriptive and deterministic manners. And just to conclude, this is a casta painting of a mestizo child right here on the left, and that became somehow the prototype for the future Mexican, which you can appreciate in the examples that I provide here with actors. That was supposed to be a national being with a capital B. So that said, I hope this can be used as an introduction to the subject. Let's please go ahead and listen to my colleagues, starting with Amy Ellman. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Pedro. Now I'm going to make Amy a host real quickly so she can start working on sharing her screen while I introduce her. Give me a quick moment. There you go. All right, Amy, you're now the host.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Perfect. So Dr. Amy Ellman is the William Weber Chair of Social Science at Kalamazoo College. She's authored a number of articles and books, most recently, The European Union, Anti-Semitism, and the Politics of Denial. She currently serves as an editorial board member for Indiana University Press's Anti-Semitism Studies and is an advisory board member at the Center for Jewish Law and Judaic Studies at DePaul University. Today, Dr. Ellman is here with us to present the lecture, All-American Anti-Semitism Through Replacement Feminism. Dr. Ellman?
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies for hosting this important event. I want to go back a bit and talk about 1982. So nearly 40 years ago, Letty Pogrobin, who was an editor of Ms. Magazine, published an article entitled Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement. And it opens in this way. Why now? Why write about anti-Semitism in the women's movement when we have the moral majority and Ronald Reagan to worry about? And our answer was this: because very simply, it's there. And because I am a Jew who has been finding problems where I had felt most safe among feminists. Well, here we are 40 years later nearly, and it wasn't the first time that Jews were betrayed by those whom they felt to be allies. And sadly, it wasn't going to be the last either. So if we step back, in the last century, Europe's Jews found themselves stateless within the very countries that had just extended them citizenship. And sadly, in the 21st century, we find ourselves in the United States in a situation whereby a rising number of American Jews find themselves politically homeless, despite our substantial contributions to established political parties, civic organizations, and not least social movements like the women's movement. Prior to tendering her resignation to the New York Times, Barry Weiss wrote, and I quote, "Whereas once it was enough to criticize Israeli government policy, specifically its treatment of Palestinians, now Israel's very existence must be denounced." Now, Jews who conformed and thus thought themselves sufficiently critical of or embarrassed by Israel have been increasingly shocked to find themselves the victims of a long-standing virus that they thought that they might be immune from. And I would count among those someone like Jonathan Weissman, who was also a former New York Times journalist, who reveals, in his words, not mine, that despite having been infatuated by Palestinian politics, complacent about anti-Semitism, and largely disconnected from Jewish faith and Jewish life, he was attacked online for being Jewish in the 2016 presidential campaign. And in recounting the vicious alt-right online threats that he and so many other prominent figures faced, his 2018 book that came out just prior to the Pittsburgh massacre, wherein 11 Jews were murdered in a synagogue, so his book just precedes that by several months. His book, Semitism, testifies to his determination to fight back. And yet there are a few things that he gets very wrong. And I want to talk about just one of those because I think it's a very common problem among folks who talk about anti-Semitism. So again, Weissman is new to anti-Semitism, and he insists in his book, and I quote, "The threat of violence against Jews has not materialized into actual violence specifically directed at us." And I want to make the argument that that assertion is very much at odds with the facts. Consider, for example, the anti-Semitic dimensions of the attack on the World Trade Center or the 2014 triple murder by a white supremacist of 3 Gentiles whom he took to be Jews outside of the Kansas City Jewish Community Center. And also when Black supremacists similarly misidentified everyone they slaughtered in the Jersey City kosher market in 2019, their rampage was no less anti-Semitic because one of those whom they killed was Gentile. In other words, the point that I want to bring home is that whether those murdered were Jews matters less than the fact that those who killed them thought they were. And I think that understanding this is crucial because we must understand anti-Semitism when and where it occurs. The now conventional claim that the murders of the 11 Jews in Pittsburgh synagogue mark the deadliest attack on Jews in US history is really off base. That designation, the deadliest attack on Jews in US history, that designation belongs to the Islamicists of 9/11 who murdered thousands, many of them Jews, because they believed in and endeavored to end Jewish world conspiracy and by extension, the Jewish state and the US support of that state. I'd argue that our inability to recognize the anti-Semitic dimensions of this genocidal ambition to destroy a people, to wipe Israel off the map, to make sure that, that there are no Jews from the river to the sea. Those kinds of efforts should be understood because if we don't, our efforts to counter anti-Semitism are utterly ineffectual, and our similar inability or unwillingness to identify as anti-Semitic those within social movements has meant that we continue to place faith in alliances and grant legitimacy to those undeserving of it. To illustrate my point, I'm going to focus specifically on the Women's March from from 2017 on. And I'm going to do this by sharing my screen. So here we go. So before corporations increased or sought to increase liquor sales, like Johnny Walker, and incorporated women's marches that promoted veiling in full-page New York Times adverts, posters, and matching shrink-wrapped buses, there were feminists who challenged male dominance, violence against women, and also female genital mutilation. Their ambitions were global because they recognized that women's rights were universal. Then, whether under the cover of being culturally sensitive, anti-imperialistic, or sex positive, self-proclaimed progressives silenced feminist critics of male domination and sexualized violence, and also of anti-Semitism. Feminists were slowly replaced by so-called revolutionaries like those seen here at the 2020 Chicago Women's March. And under the auspices of women's rights, we see the world's first woman hijacker from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This is Leila Khalid, and she's being glorified. And the question that I'm asking in this presentation is, how did feminism's replacement come about, and what are the consequences relating to anti-Semitism's resurgence and the growing convergence between far left and Islamist forces, a convergence that's often ignored by those like Jonathan Weissman. And I think that by 1990, what we saw was Islamicists began to fill the ideological void that the Soviet Empire had previously occupied in demanding women's subordination to the greater cause. That year, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC pictured here, disparaged feminist mobilizations for universal rights as racist and culturally insensitive, and then claimed the mantle of feminism for itself by adopting its own Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. The OIC, by the way, is the world's largest intergovernmental organization after the United Nations, which is now having its 75th anniversary. And the OIC's 50+ Muslim majority member countries hold significant sway in the United Nations, which I think explains a lot of the problems that we're having. Their declaration insists on an Islamic perspective on human rights that prove consistent with Sharia law. And that includes the rights of husbands to discipline their wives, divorce them at will, and even deny them permission to leave their homes. Cairo, by the way, was not the only effort by the OIC to inform international human rights discourse. In 1975, the OIC worked with the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Soviet Union to have the UN's International Women's Conference explicitly condemn Zionism. And 7 years later, you have Lady Pogrebin's article, Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement. The women's decade that followed from 1975 descended into anti-Zionist diatribes and scarcely mentioned women at all. And I think that Lady Pogrebin saw something that it's taken too many people too long to see thereafter, which was that effort was really a harbinger of things to come. A similar hijacking of the World Conference Against Racism occurred in 2001, and by 2016, the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women condemned only one country in the entire world for violations against women's rights, and that country was Israel. The 2017 Women's March played its part in projecting the new face of American feminism onto the world stage through live coverage of a tightly controlled DC podium where only those in agreement with its 4 self-proclaimed feminist organizers or those who were able to confer legitimacy to those women were granted access. So those like Kimberly Crenshaw, who is representing women of color who were the victims of police violence could not have access. So there stood Linda Sarsour, a prominent proponent of Sharia and the Bernie Bros. Having opposed Clinton by insisting smart women, this is her quote, not mine, smart women don't vote based on gender, the press, as you can imagine, was infatuated with and helped create this new poster feminist who had castigated feminists for some time. In fact, in 2016, she hailed Saudi Arabia for its 10 weeks of paid maternity leave, tweeting to feminist critics, quote, "And you're worried about women driving? Put us to shame." Yet her most violent and earlier rhetoric targeted her most outspoken Muslim opponents like Ayan Hirsi Ali, a survivor of female genital mutilation, whose vagina, as you can see on the upper left side, Sarsour threatened to remove. And in keeping with the OIC's jihadist strategies and Soviet left ideology, she also demanded that Zionist feminists be cast outside of the very women's movement that so many Jewish women had helped to establish. Her co-chair, Tamika Mallory, was of like mind. Mallory cut her own political teeth co-chairing the 20th anniversary of the Nation of Islam's Million Man March in 2015. Although the Southern Poverty Law Center recognizes the Nation of Islam as a Black nationalist hate group, Mallory extended an Instagram shout out to Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam's leader, seen here in a 2018 shout out referring to him as the GOAT, which is to say the greatest of all time. Her unflinching enthusiasm for and her defense of the Nation of Islam as a force for good in the African American community, I think, has helped extend cover to Farrakhan's unmatched branding in this country of Jews as the embodiment of evil. Mallory's position is, though, very much consistent with, and I think reminiscent of, the gender theorist Judith Butler's support of Hamas and Hezbollah as leftist progressive groups. Here's Hezbollah pictured here. Butler's acceptance of their sexism and their annihilationist stand toward Israel, and as you'll see, all Jews, and she identifies herself as Jewish, syncs with her postmodern mentor, Michel Foucault's support of the Ayatollah Khomeini, a dictator who I think would have endorsed Michel Foucault's murder for being gay. Foucault's eroticization of death, I think, can help to explain his fascination with and his refusal to condemn the Ayatollah's regime, but I think that his misogyny accounts for his silencing of the nearly 50,000 women pictured here who turned out in Tehran in 1979 for International Women's Day in defiance of Khomeini's order that they veil themselves. Hezbollah at that point in 1979 was a newly minted party of God, and its response to the women pictured here, and now you don't see them in the streets unveiled in anything like this, so this is quite an interesting picture. The Hezbollah's response to these women was essentially cover yourselves or be beaten. Utterly at ease with Iranian totalitarianism, Foucault suggested that early feminist warnings about the regime were antiquated attacks on Islam, a stance that I think has since been salvaged by those similarly in support of or who refuse to condemn Islamists, portraying those who are critical of this kind of behavior as Islamophobic, portraying Hamas or Hezbollah as progressive social movements, embracing the Nation of Islam as a force of good, and insisting that nothing is creepier than Zionism while posing as feminist, appeals both to a supposedly pro-woman left and the far right, to include those like David Duke, talking about the convergence between left and right. Here's David Duke responding to a post by Sarsour. What's that saying about a broken clock. Countering these reactionaries requires exposing their sexual politics and their Orwellian logic as dystopic. And I think that if we fall short, our opponents will continue to satirize anti-Semitism, as you see here to the left, anti-Semitism by insisting that they're both the victims of, because supposedly you can't be critical of Israel, that they're the victims of anti-Semitism. Such, sadly, was the case when feminism's opponents co-opted women's rights, and I fear similar fate awaits us as anti-Semites continue to co-opt Judaism and social justice itself. So that's why panels such as this at the Ackerman are absolutely crucial, and I appreciate just this opportunity to be part of this panel.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I'm going to make our next presenter host so she can start preparing to share her screen if she needs to. There we go. All right, now you're host. So our next speaker is Dr. Katya Gibel-Mevorach, who holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University. She received her BA and her MA in African Studies from Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. She's a professor in anthropology and American Studies at Grinnell College, and her work addresses the topics and issues of identity and social science categories, race in the curriculum, and diversity in higher education. Today, she's discussing challenges teaching about the intersecting phenomenon of race and anti-Semitism. And I hope that I said your name correctly. If not, please correct me.
You did, and I'm not sure what's happening on my screen, to be honest.
Okay, now I see it's got a frozen.
It's got a frozen from Amy, is what I see.
Okay, so I see a frozen wiggle of your PowerPoint. Pedro, will you unmute yourself and tell me what you see so we can figure out where the issue is?
Or I can just...
I was looking at the last slide from Amy's presentation.
Okay, so that's what, here we go. All right, so do you want to unshare and then try resharing your screen?
Yes, so I've just gone to share screen. Sorry, everybody. And I don't have to share, but I did have something to share. Am I sharing?
Nope, we see you right now.
And now? Still not?
No.
Oh, well, then I may not be able to share, which will be too unfortunate. I don't want to pull out of the Zoom. I could pull out and start again. I'm not quite sure what the problem here is. But let me rethink now. Some of Amy's comments kind of threw me. I was surprised that Shahana McKinney-Baldwin wasn't mentioned. She's Ashkenazi, Black, Jewish, and she was also part of that Women's March. And so there's a lot of discussions. But let me backtrack a bit, and I'm going to look at my PowerPoint, even though you can't see it. And I want to start from a different perspective. In teaching about challenges today of bringing anti-Semitism into the same conversation as racism, I'd like to suggest that they have drifted apart partially because of the way in which racism is being visually conceptualized and the way then that anti-Semitism comes to be visually represented as two different entities, with skin color being of particular significance in the United States. Makes sense that skin color would make a difference, and we're speaking the day after the judgment on Breonna Taylor. I don't think we should lose sight of that since we're convening in the U.S. But once racism on the American side is only in terms of color, and European racism is forgotten in its biological context, and Jews are removed from that discussion of race being very important to how Jews were defined as a group to be eliminated, exterminated. Once we have that division, it is very difficult in a classroom with 18, 20, 25-year-olds today to bring the two topics together without an effort. And by that, I also mean to say that I think most of us are aware of the fact that so many young people, and young here, I mean under 40 even, are totally unaware of the Holocaust. They know it from the movies, they have vague ideas, but in terms of the graphic, visceral, actual practice of street violence, that is not something that they are aware of at all. And this is a big issue. So I'd like to consider that when we teach, or when I teach a course on anti-Semitism, I put a lot of emphasis on vocabulary, on images and on vocabulary. So with images, I usually start out with an image of two small children. And if you will indulge me, I will try one more time to see if my screen share will work. And I don't think that I'm enabled to screen share. I see on here one participant can share at a time, multiple, advanced. I've been made the host, but does this now work?
There we go. We have it.
Oh, great. Okay. Then let me just do something which is really unprofessional, but I want to just go back to this picture because this is what I wanted to show as Amy was speaking. It is very difficult to see this photo and to be persuasive that Israel does not have a problem. And I speak as an Israeli and as somebody who still defines myself as a Zionist. This image is offensive in Israel, but it's also offensive outside of Israel today. Where I wanted to start was the question of whiteness studies, vocabulary images, the absence of Jews from multicultural topics, and how that relates to indigeneity and occupier. So one of the questions that I think is significant is whether or not political anti-Semitism, the kind that has defined Israel as a Western outpost of the United States, is a byproduct of the rise of whiteness studies, which started out as something interesting, started out as something quite useful, and then morphed into something very different. So the picture that I was about to tell you is these two children. And I won't waste time asking and waiting for a response, but both of these children would have been considered in the time that they were taken as colored. So in our American 21st century, they are both African-American children. And how do we know that? And how would we know that they're both slaves? By the position in which they are standing. In this period before the Civil War, no white child, defined legally as white, would have been standing in such intimacy with a black-bodied child. And this is because in the United States, from 1662, before we had the full concept of racial hierarchy, of differentiating groups of people in the racial taxonomy, the question was, what was the child of a Negro slave? Why? Because white men were impregnating new slaves. And the decision had nothing to do with color and everything to do with property. So the child of a Negro woman would be a slave or free, depending on the status of the woman. And that continued for a long time. But these images tend to be forgotten. And the idea of race as something fixed and based on color also was forgotten. In fact, a student of mine 2 days ago found his great-grandfather's certificate of naturalization, and it looks exactly like my mother's certificate of naturalization, different time periods, and the word race does not appear, complexion appears for color, and there were different kinds of color. Did not identify whether a person was of African ancestry or not. So I also point out, and I think there was something in the chat, where did we move from the idea of race to the idea of ethnicity? How do we end up speaking about Jews as an ethnic group, Jews as a racial group, Jews differentiated from other white people? Well, this happens around World War II. Again, something that If students aren't taught that, they can't know. So one of the ways that I meet that particular challenge is to provide literature from anthropologists of the 1890s, and then writers writing about the notion of anti-Semitism in the 1930s. I also provide information from the American Jewish Yearbook from 1914, which talks about the new Jewish immigrants. 4 different groups of immigrants are identified, and they are not identified by ethnicity because the word doesn't exist. And I ask my students, find the word ethnicity. Well, you can't find the word ethnicity before texts of the 1940s because ethnicity came to replace the biological notion of race because of the rise of Nazism. But what they do learn by looking at the demographics of Jews is that Jews are global people. And in 1914, there is still an idea that Jews are not white, that Jews are Jews, that Jews are a people, that Jews are in a diaspora, that Jews are in a diaspora, a global diaspora, because of an exile. If I start with that as the premise for moving into a discussion of where Jews appear on the American landscape, I don't have to be limited to the American landscape. I immediately am back on a global landscape, talking about anti-Semitism, and requires the various definitions that anti-Semitism has been given since the 1930s, because it's in the 1930s that a discussion of what constitutes anti-Semitism begins. But by starting with this differentiation of race, color, and ancestry, and its replacement with the idea of ethnicity, that then does not extend to people of African descent, I'm able to also bring my students to images of this, the Nuremberg laws. Otherwise, they wouldn't see it. If I were to put black and white in the American context and speak about race mixture, or in a Latin American context, mestizos, or in a French context, métissage, we would never get to this kind of imagery that determined who would be burned in a crematorium and who would not, because this is not about slavery. I come back to the idea of thinking about whiteness with the very important essay of Peggy McIntosh, where the discourse in the United States about whiteness comes to be focused on appearance. And again, reminding us here that I have to work with my students and get them to remember something that they don't know, which is that until the civil rights movement and until integration, looking at a person and seeing white skin did not determine legal in the South or social whiteness. Once we get to the 1980s, the discussion of whiteness as something that we can see, we move into the discussion of privilege. And in this context, Jews become privileged. Why do Jews become privileged? Because Jews are beginning to be viewed only as whites of a different religion. And of course, I'm bringing all these different points up because each one opens up an entire library of research and of books on the shelf that have already been written. But where there's a discussion of Jews as white and where there is a representation of Jews as white, discussions of alliances and the fracturing of alliances disappear into white people versus Black people, and moves very quickly away from discussions about power and leverage within the United States, and also leaves the conversation to very much of an American conversation rather than a global conversation. This is the question of political anti-Semitism. We go back to 1967, and I point out to those of you who are older, who are already familiar with James Baldwin, but younger people who are less familiar, one of the things that James Baldwin said in 1967 was that Negroes were not anti-Semitic because they're anti-white. They were resentful of the ways in which assimilation and the effort to be accepted into white Christian America had succeeded. And for some of you may be familiar with the film Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck from 1947, or with the film Crossfire with Robert Mitchum and Robert Young. Those would be two examples of films which taught the American public that Jews are no different from Christians. Christians go to church, Jews go to temple, but really they're the same. Gone is the diasporic, global, multicolored, multilingual aspect of Jews as a people. Another way in which Jews are recreated as white ethnics is a very famous, these were very famous if you grew up in New York City until the 1960s, advertisements for Levi's rye bread. The thing about popular advertising and popular culture is that it can be digested, ingested, naturalized, normalized to the point where the messages seem to be obviously correct. So learning to see not Jewish meant, well, there's nobody who's Chinese and Jewish, there's nobody who's Black and Jewish, there's nobody who's American Indian Jewish. Jewish is Ashkenazi, European, and white. Yiddish is the prime language of the Jews, losing sight of the fact that already in 1914, there is in fact a discussion of the four different groups of Jews based not on country, but based on language. And the languages were German, Yiddish as a outgrowth of German, but also Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, and Greek, with an emphasis on the Jews from the Balkans, the Jews from Turkey, and some Jews coming in from North Africa and the Middle East. The majority of Jews from North Africa and the Middle East will not come to the United States until more recently. Completely forgotten in the ways in which Jews as a people are overlooked in favor of simply the history of Jews from Europe is this large diaspora that spans more than what is here in this particular image that I have, because further below we have India, we have Ethiopia, and we don't see that here. But that Jews begin in Arabia. Jews and Muslims have a closer affinity than Jews and Christians. That is completely outside of the narrative of the history of Jews in the United States. I like to show my students this particular image to ask them who is Jewish and who is Arab, which also allows for the question, what do we mean today when we reference Arab? And some of you may be familiar with Albert Mehme and others and the discussion of Arab Jews, where Arabic language, Arabic culture, Arabic values coming from Arabic-speaking countries is very much a part of the Jewish experience. It is very much not a part of the popular discussions of Jews in the United States. The image of Africa and the Middle East is not the image that most people, most lay people, and many Jews do not reference in their minds or associate in their minds when they think about Jews. And yet in Morocco, until recently, Lebanon, in Turkey, and of course in Europe and in Israel, Jews of North African descent and Jews of Middle Eastern descent Jews of Iranian descent, continue to have a strong, not affiliation with their countries of origin, but continue to enjoy the fact that there is a rich literary, cultural, and historical past to the Jewish history of the East, not just of the West. So the challenge, if I were to summarize it, the challenge which I face in the classroom, and I think many of us do face, is the juxtaposition of terms, Jews as white, and increasingly Jewish, in English, Jewish newspapers like The Forward, since the 1980s and not before, emphasize the phrase white Jews. It has come to be ubiquitous among young people to simply speak of white Jews, but we don't speak about white Arabs or white Palestinians. And they can be blonde and blue-eyed. They can look exactly like Jews or not. What does a Jew look like? A Jew does not look like. And so what does white Jew mean when it's used as an adjective that carries something other weight? The idea of exodus and diaspora and therefore refugees is something which has been dissociated with the Jewish experience. Jews of the Middle East, Jews of North Africa, it's not integrated in discussions. Therefore, some people can maintain refugee status for a long time, others not. Let me just scroll through a couple of images which are very prevalent in Europe, definitely in Israel, with all of the internal problems, and completely absent from associations that both American Jews and just regular American white people and Americans in general do not associate with as Jews. If you show this picture and you take away the title, most Americans are not going to recognize this photo and say, ah, this is a Jewish wedding. Now, some of this is, again, reinforced by popular culture and popular images. We don't hear or think about Bukhari Jews, Kurdish Jews. We don't think of Ethiopian Jews except as something which is exotic. We do not, in the United States, speak of Jews as a global people, as a paradigm of multiculturalism. Let me leave this on the screen for a moment. One of the problems then of political anti-Semitism is discussions about Israel get muddled into discussions about Jews. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Depends. I want to suggest that it depends. I want to stop sharing and come back to me. The claim that certain groups of people are not allowed to criticize Israel, and if criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, that claim has begun to be a big problem. There are many Israelis, some of whom are not in Israel at the moment, unfortunately, and that includes myself. I have guilt about having left, and I did not leave for any reason except to get a PhD, of the direction in which Israel has gone. It is almost as if certain of the political events in Israel have have become what they were accused of. So we have become occupiers and not simply people defending our own rights. We need, those who are Jewish particularly, need to be able to discuss that without, by knee-jerk reaction, saying, well, this person who's criticizing Israel is a racist, or this person has disappointed our sense of alliance. We need to be able to criticize Israel. We need to be able to criticize the Israeli government. And we need to be able to do that by emphasizing that criticism is different from seeking the removal, the elimination of the state of Israel. In other words, to be able to continue to discuss openly that there have been and there continue to be two people with claims on the land, two nationalist aspirations. And some of those conversations have moved on. We cannot continue a discourse about racism and anti-Semitism that leaves the two discussions separate by using Israel to continue to divide instead to bridge together both the theoretical and the practical implications of anti-Jewishness, and I say anti-Jewishness now and not simply anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. And I would end by saying that it seems to me that our effort in the US should be to emphasize, to continue to emphasize Jewishness, Jewish people as a people who are culturally different, speak different languages, are adapted in different host countries, and that the microcosm of the Jewish people is the state of Israel, is in the state of Israel, but that the state of Israel is also today a diverse place. And so I would end with that.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you're able to share your screen there at the end. So now I'm gonna switch the role of host. There we go. All right. Our final speaker is Dr. Navras Afridi, whose name I probably butchered, but I hope he'll forgive me. He's an assistant professor in the Department of History at Presidency University in Kolkata, India, where he teaches courses in Jewish history, genocide studies, interfaith relations, and minority studies. He's the author of several articles and texts, including the monograph, Jews, Judaizing Movements, and the Traditions of Israelite Descent in South Asia. Notably, he was amongst the first to contribute to Jewish studies in the Urdu language, and today he's going to be sharing with us his lecture, The Impact of the Hindu Caste System on Abrahamic Religious Communities in India.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I shall give you an overview of the Hindu caste system, and then I shall proceed to talk about how it has left an impact on each of the three Abrahamic religious communities in India. 79.8% of India's total population, or 1.3 billion, is considered Hindu. The Hindu society is divided into 4 varnas or classes in a hierarchy in which the Brahmins or priests are at the top. Below them are the Kshatriyas or warriors or rulers, followed by Vaishyas, merchants and traders, and at the bottom are the Shudras, that is peasants and the working class. Each of these 4 varnas or classes are further subdivided into a number of jatis or castes. Shudras are represented in contemporary India by the section of population classified under the category other backward castes. They are 42% of India's population. Those who are not considered part of any of these classes are seen as falling out of the class system and have been subjected to worst forms of social discrimination for centuries, to the extent that they were considered untouchables. Untouchability is prohibited in modern India and is punishable by imprisonment, yet it has not ended yet. It continues to be strong, particularly in rural India, where 66% of India's population lives. Those traditionally treated as untouchables are now called Dalits or scheduled castes. They are 16.6% of India's population, around 166 million. There are reservations in jobs in government institutions of education for these depressed sections of society under the state's affirmative action. But those members of these sections who convert to any Abrahamic religion cease to be eligible for such benefits and reservations. It is so because it is believed that casteism is peculiar to Hinduism. The political activism of Sikh and Buddhist communities led to the amendment of the 1950 presidential order. Subsequently, Sikh and Buddhist Dalits were also considered eligible for benefits in 1956 and 1990, respectively. The 1950 presidential order, however, continues to exclude Dalits who converted to Islam or Christianity from its ambit, despite ample evidence that they suffer equal hardships as other Dalit communities. All the fact is that even if a Dalit converts to Islam or Christianity, it fails to bring about the desired result in terms of social mobility, for it is perceived as only a change of faith and not of birth, the basis of caste affiliation. The discriminatory caste system has left a strong impact on the social structures of all 3 Abrahamic religious communities in India. It is pervasive and entrenched in Indian society. The dominant narrative is that anti-Semitism has been absolutely unknown in India. That is what the dominant narrative is. It is not entirely true. there has always been anti-Semitism, though it has been limited to certain sections of Indian society. At the same time, it is an anti-Semitism that has never translated itself into violence. It has largely been limited to rhetoric. It is true that India and China are the only two such places in the world where Jews could live in peace and harmony with their neighbors without any persecution. The only thing that distinguishes the Jewish story in India from that in China is the fact that there is no Jewish community in China anymore. It ceased to exist long ago because of assimilation into the Han nationality. Yet this did not happen in India. It was the Indian caste system that proved to be a blessing in disguise for them. For Indian society is largely endogamous. People marry only within their caste. So there was never any desire on the part of Indians to intermarry with Jews. So this kind of helped the Jews retain their separate identity. Also the fact that Hindus are a non-proselytizing people, there was also no desire on the part of Hindus to convert the Jews in their midst to Hinduism. Yet, the Jews did come to be seen as a kind of separate caste group. Indian Jewry is represented by six different groups. Numerically, the largest of these groups is the Beni Israel community. According to their own tradition, they have been resident in India since 175 BCE. But we do not have any documentary evidence to support this claim of theirs. The oldest historical reference to their existence in Western India, in the state of Maharashtra, comes from the year 1738. They were a rural people, and their occupation was that of oil pressers. And because of their abstinence from work on Saturdays, they came to be known in the local language as Shanwar Telis, that is Saturday oil men. They fell out of the ambit of the Hindu caste system, yet they embraced the caste system in a manner that they divided themselves into two different groups. And they called them, and those groups were Gora Israel and Kala Israel. Gora Israel claimed descent from the original settlers in the Konkan strip of the western coast of India, while Kala Israel were offspring of intermarriage between the Beni Israel and other communities. In the past, all social contact between the two groups were restricted. But as of now, no such distinction remains anymore. The Beni Israel had only minimal observance of Judaism. They kept kashrut, they observed Sabbath, they circumcised their children, they did not indulge in idol worship, they were monotheists, but they did not have any scriptures. What is interesting is that a religious revival came about in the community as a result of their interface with Christian missionaries who felt that it would be easier to convert them to Christianity as they were monotheists in a sea of polytheists. Yet the Beni Israel were clever enough to receive lessons from the Christian missionaries in Hebrew and in English. And it was the Christian missionaries who translated for them the Hebrew Bible into their language, Marathi and Konkani, for the first time. Yet they did not convert to Christianity. The Hindu-Beni Israel relationship was based on the principle of acceptance rather than equality. Dignity of labor is a concept that has largely been elusive in Indian society, and as they made a living with their occupation of oil pressing, they were just a level above the untouchables. Another thing that is interesting about Hindu society is that all people of foreign origin have been considered polluting in Hindu society and have been called Malech. As a Malech, any foreigner stood completely outside the caste system and the ritual ambience. Thus, historically, contact with them was viewed by the caste Hindu as polluting. So, if there was discrimination against them, it was largely based on xenophobia rather than anti-Semitism. They were not being discriminated against for being Jewish, but they were being discriminated against for not being Hindus and not belonging to any of the three upper classes of Hindus. The Bene Israel even abstained from using the term Yehudi or Jew for themselves, as they felt that it was perceived in Indian society as a term of reproach, even if not in the larger Indian society, but certainly in the Muslim discourse. And India is home to the world's second largest Muslim population. And the Muslims established a number of kingdoms in India in its history, so they had to be conscious of that. The native historian Samuel Kahimka does not use the term anti-Semitism in the book that he wrote in the year 1897. Nevertheless, if anti-Semitism is used as a term to describe hatred, prejudice, persecution, and discrimination against Jews, then it seems clear that Kahimka was speaking about anti-Semitism. That emancipation came about as a result of the advent of the British, when Bombay developed as a major metropolis under the British, and they came to be employed in civil services and in the army. This brought about a complete transformation of the community, and they got transformed from a rural community into an urban community. And in urban India, the grip of casteism is certainly not as strong as it is in the rural community, in rural India, in countryside India. The best known of India's Jewish communities has been the Kochini community. According to their tradition, there were 10,000 Jews who arrived in Trangnor soon after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. P. Shanguni Menon, author of A History of Travancore, is of the opinion that, I quote him now, Anjuvarnam alluded to the plate in possession of the Cochin Jews, is a distinction given to the Jews. Varnam is not here intended for color as the Jews understand it, but caste. There were already 4 Varnams. Varnam is a variant of the Sanskrit term Varn, which means class. Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. The Jews, when they came to Kerala, were considered a peculiar nation, and the Brahmins and others, seeing their strict observance of religious rites and knowing not how to designate them, styled them Anjuvarnam, that is, the 5th caste. So here also, the Jews in Cochin came to be seen more or less as a different caste group. But the Jews in Cochin enjoys great privileges, a very high status in society, and they were exempt from almost all taxes. The first time that they ever paid taxes was when the state of Travancore merged with the Indian Union, and it was decided by the Indian state to treat the Jews there just like any other Indians. The Jews in Kerala too got really strongly impacted by the Hindu caste system, and there emerged 2 different groups among the Jews in Cochin: white Jews and black Jews. White Jews were descendants of the Jews who had come from Europe and settled there, and they were white in their skin color. The black Jews were as dark as the people of the local population, and they were believed to have descended from the slaves who had converted to Judaism. And these white Jews even discriminated against these black Jews by either not permitting them inside their synagogues, and even if they were permitted inside the synagogues, they were often made to sit on the floor and not on the benches. Jews have largely been seen as outsiders, and during the May 2019 Indian parliamentary elections, a Muslim member of the Legislative Assembly, a former member of the Legislative Assembly who happens to be Muslim, Asif Muhammad Khan, tried to depict Atishi Marlena, a contestant from a rival party, the Aam Aadmi Party, as Jewish, in spite of the fact that she is not. He believed that the Muslim voters of the concerned constituency would see it as a disqualifier, and thus these insinuations would influence the election result. She eventually lost. According to Khan, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians are brothers to each other, but not Jews. He was captured in a video that is available online, proclaiming that the Jew has no place in India and that people have to spread this message to every household. Another Jewish community in India is the Baghdadi community. The members of this community did not come only from the city of Baghdad, but they came from a number of places in the Middle East. But in the colloquial language, they all came to be known by the term Baghdadi because Baghdad was a major commercial center then. Baghdadi settled in India primarily between the decades of 1790s and 1830s. It did not take them very long to realize that it was wiser to identify with the colonizer rather than the colonized. So they tried their best to get recognized as whites, benefiting from their lighter skin color. And since this is what they were aspiring for, they deliberately tried to keep a distance from the already settled Beni Israel Jews who had been living in India for centuries, and even went to the extent of doubting their Jewishness, so that they did not come to be seen as part and parcel of the dark-skinned Beni Israel Jews. Then there are three Judaizing movements that have emerged among the Dalits in India. Two of these movements, one of these movements has emerged among the Dalits, and that movement is the Beni Ephraim movement. It is seen as their response to Hindu caste system. But all of these Judaizing movements, even if not necessarily among the Dalits, have come to be seen as byproducts of Christianity. The Beni Ephraim movement emerged among the Madiga Dalits in the state of Andhra Pradesh in South India. They realized that in spite of their conversion to Christianity, it hadn't brought about the desired result in terms of their social status. So they felt that if they could somehow prove themselves to be of foreign origin and of Israelite genealogy, it might help. So this was seen as the incentive. There are about 250 families who have started practicing Judaism, and the total number of individuals practicing Judaism in this community is estimated to be 650. The other Judaizing movement is the Beni Menashe that emerged in Northeast India in the tribes of Chin, Lushai, and Kuki. And the third Judaizing movement is among a small group called Chettiar in Tamil Nadu. All of these three groups were Christians prior to their conversion to Judaism. Casteism has also left a deep impact on Muslims in India. The Muslims can be broadly divided into Ashraf and Ajlaf. Ashraf form the elite and are perceived to be people of foreign stock, descendants of Arabs, Turks, and Mongols who settled in India, while the Ajlaf are those who are seen as native to the country. As far as the Christians are concerned, the upper caste Hindu converts to Christianity do not marry with the low caste Hindu converts to Christianity. The upper caste converts to Christianity only marry amongst themselves, while the low caste converts to Christianity marry within themselves. So endogamy is a feature that has been embraced from the Hindu society and has now become part of all Abrahamic religious communities in India now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we've had quite a few constructive, informative comments in the chat, so thank you to everyone who shared there. We have had a question for Dr. Mevarok. Do you think this tendency to see Jewish people as white is a sociological, psychological reaction to the Holocaust, as it was European Jewry who bore the burden of the period?
No, and I want to make a very important correction here. You know, I am the descendant, my mother was a refugee, and my grandfather had to leave behind his mother and his sister, and everybody vanished in the crematoriums. If the Allies had not defeated the Nazis, the Germans, in North Africa, the story of the Shoah, in terms of a much wider geographical compass, would have been much bigger. For the most part, and until very recently, North Africa and the Middle East are left out of the discussion about the Shoah. So that's number one. And this is a big mistake, particularly in the United States, less so in Europe. And there's sufficient material on that. And if somebody wants, I can open up my share screen. I won't monopolize the time to do that at the moment. That's number one. Number two, Karen Sachs wrote, first it was an article and then it became a book, and now it's become a ubiquitous phrase, How the Jews Became White. But the reality is that even, as I say, in 1914, in the American Jewish Yearbook and subsequent yearbooks, there is clear information about Jews who are not just coming from Eastern Europe at the time, because the German Jews were already here in the United States. They were settled, they were assimilated, they came over assimilated. Some escaped, some like Franz Boas, forgotten, leaving for anti-Semitic reasons. He couldn't get a position at the university, and others simply to come to the new world. But there was very systematically, very consciously, very intentionally an effort to integrate into and to be accepted by white America. And we have to begin with that. Most immigrants come to America and they don't want to associate with the people at the bottom of the scale. They want to associate with the people who are upwardly mobile and who have been accepted. Race as a biological connotation very much is part of American racism. Appearance then becomes very much a part of the cultural language in which, and imagery within which we can imagine groups of people. And once Jewish Americans on screen, in writing, disconnect with themselves as a people of whom there are many different relatives, if you want that language, once Jewish images are only of a particular kind of white American who happens to have a religion called Judaism, once that becomes the popular discourse, it is very easy then for Jews to only be seen as white. It is not a consequence of the Holocaust. It is a consequence of very careful efforts to become part of and accepted by white Christian America. And I would say that continues right today. And it is one of the biggest mistakes that can happen. I would recommend for a film, the film Sunshine with Ralph Fiennes. Currently in the US, it is not available on Amazon. It is available on iTunes. I would also recommend, because my students just saw it, I would recommend the film, which is on Amazon, Karen Albu's the wedding song.
Wonderful. Okay, we do have a couple more questions in the chat. Okay, for Dr. Gonzalez, please comment on Catholic hostility towards Jews and Judaism in Mexican society. Also, most Jews in Mexico are not Ashkenazi, but Sephardic or Syrian. They also are castigated by Arab political establishment throughout Latin America for their connection to Zionism in Israel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. That's a complex question. We were just looking at the fact that sometimes we don't have enough time to unfold and examine every single aspect related to this type of conversation. So I'm going to ask you to be patient and lenient somehow, where we are working only within 15, 20 minutes time to talk about very complex issues. First of all, yes, if we consider that the parting point of a common history of Mexicans living as Mexicans as we know them, that is multinational, speaking Spanish with certain identity features, begins with the conquest and then the subsequent colonial period. We need to have in mind that the idea of race and especially anti-Semitism arrives with the idea of thinking of people in terms of purity of blood, right? And that relates to what we've been talking about in terms of physiognomy, skin color, ethnicity, etc. Why? Because initially the violence of the anti-Semitic action was rooted in the fact that this was something invisible that people carried in the veins. So I'm talking about Spain and the fact that the new Christians were supposed to be pure without stain, and that namely that was the stain of Jewish blood and Muslim blood. So when that gets extrapolated into the colony, into the New Spain and the other viceroyalties, the result is that this anti-Semitic perspective and or racial perspective has a little to do with the appearance, right? Is more related to religion. That is gonna evolve. And throughout the period of the Inquisition, we see the persecution of crypto Jews. They can be detected by a number of practices, but yes, that's the origin. And so we need to have in mind Catholic violence against Jewish people in the terms of making almost a institutional way of exclusion and creating the other, which is going to give birth to also a number of other types of classifications, such as the Caste system, which derives from this idea of purity. And then we're going to see a development going towards biology, appearance. That's going to be confirmed in the 19th century. So that was a long, complex question. Now let me see the second part of the question. Yes, I think I probably gave the impression that that Orthodox community was targeted because of their appearance, and yes, you're right. But the fact here is that when we talk about anti-Semitism, immediately some kind of a really abstract idea of whiteness and that membership to the superior caste kicks in. So that's when we get arguments from the typical right stereotype based on biology, appearance, and then we can see also expressions from the left, which is more political and associates imperialism, colonialism with just any type of Jewish denomination. As a matter of fact, I would think and say that it's very hard for the average Mexican people to tell the difference between Jewish denominations. So that is a very abstract, but however functional way of engaging in anti-Semitic discussions. Needless to say, they go and quickly turn into anti-Zionism, and even though there's difficulty to define who's on the side of who, the clear answer to this problem is that there is a common enemy, and that is the foreigner, or in the case of indigenous people, the minorities, those who are not encompassed by the greater idea of being mestizo and what that means, which I need to emphasize again, is not only appearance, is not only skin color, is the entire conglomerate of association with a superior casta or caste. That's what I show you the picture of this astronaut. Regardless of personal customs and practices, that seems to be the common perception, that we need to go back to that idea, abstract idea of being made of only two people. And I don't know if that's clear enough. I want to thank you for your participation. At this point, I think if we can open the discussion and the forum for more questions. I haven't seen the chat. I think we have a lot of more questions. But if in the case that we do not have questions from the public, and I repeat, I have not seen the chat yet, we can all start working on our own conversations, and that is an invitation for Nafras, Katia, and Ami to clarify, to answer directly to some previous comments. If you want to go ahead and do that, now is the time. If not, maybe Cindy can help us with more questions from the chat.
Okay, we do have one more question from the chat, but it looks like Dr. Frady answered it directly. Would you mind answering that for everyone who didn't see it in the chat, please, Dr. Frady?
Sure, I'll be happy to do so. Let me just go back to that question. Just a minute. Yes, the question was that many Bnei Menashe specifically have gone on to live in high numbers in more ideological West Bank settlements like Bethel. Is this related to social/theological dynamics in India at all? Or how has the lost tribe movements been either instrumentalized or in practice ended up in support of West Bank settlement, ended up embedded in the West Bank settlement movement? My response is that the people who have been most welcoming to the members of the Judaic movements from India to Israel are the religious nationalists. They are also part of the settler movement, so they feel happy if the new settlers make their home in Judea and Samaria, how they refer to West Bank. Plus, there is also a practical, logistical reason to it. The real estate in West Bank is not as expensive as it is within the Green Line. So it also has to do with the weak financial position of these new settlers in Israel. And that is for this reason that they also prefer to settle in the West Bank. And another reason is that they are a very religiously observant people. So they prefer to live amongst religiously observant Jews rather than the very secular Jews of Tel Aviv and other urban areas within the Green Line in Israel. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Just to add to that, and as Pedro said, there's so many threads, each of which is a 2-day conference. But on the West Bank settlement, it does not, everything in Hebrew is now translated into English. So people who used to not be able to read, I could keep things hidden. That's not possible anymore. The West Bank settlers, the right, the Bibi right, and the far right have been very opportunistic in wanting quickly to settle the West Bank with people who either cannot afford other areas or who don't want to. So religion has been politicized in Israel. And I would add to that, that the evangelical right, and we know this sitting in the United States because many of Trump's supporters are the evangelical right. The evangelical right has also been very supportive of entrenching development and people being on what I still call the West Bank, not just Judea Samaria, rather than expanding investments in what are now used to be called development towns in Israel and are now called peripheral towns. And that's where we can see both a divide domestically within Israel. I don't think that we can leave that out of the equation of discussions about racism and how it slips so easily, Israel slips so easily into a discourse of that's a white racist country when it's much more complicated. But we do have to deal with the issue of internal hierarchies and how that spills outside of the country.
Excellent, thank you. And Pedro, if you want to go ahead and facilitate a conversation amongst the three of you to kind of wrap up any loose ends and tie a bow on this, that'd be fabulous.
All right. So I guess the first question would be: Do we need to clarify anything else or have a conversation among ourselves? I don't want to guide the final conclusions towards just one focal point. Do you want to say anything else, please? Nafras, Katia, or Anya?
Why don't we let Dr. Ellman kind of kick us off then? Because I think that we haven't heard from her for a while.
All right.
Well, surely. One of the things that I'm thinking about is the way in which, and I really don't in any way profoundly disagree with anything that my colleagues have said, but the emphasis sometimes interests me that Jews are, like women in general, constantly put into the position of having to be responsible for ourselves. I don't have a problem with being responsible for ourselves, but I think that sometimes when we talk about, for instance, the ways in which Jews are responsible for making ourselves white, one of the things that we don't understand is the way that that's been done for us. In other words, our identity is constructed for us constantly. It's not just the case that, let's say, from the 1980s, Jews have been constructed as white. Again, I find this ahistorical. There's a great piece that was done in Modern Judaism in May of 2020 by Stephen Norwood and Eunice Pollack that talk about the unique contributions that the Nation of Islam had in constructing Jews, all of us, as white. You know, the term the white devil and so forth. So we have to be responsible for our own racism, our own hierarchies, and yet we also have to be truly sensitive to the ways in which so much of what gets said about us are things that sometimes we don't have much control over. And we just have to be sensitive to the history there. That's all I have to say for now.
All right. I would ask Katia to.
I don't agree. There is responsibility, and it's not all Jews in the 1960s and 70s were willing to, or to this day, just because of appearance, were willing to take on the identity of white. And I'm using white now to differentiate between the adjective and white as an identity. The Forward is a newspaper which is intended to be not only for people who are Jews, but that's the target audience. They made an editorial decision. They keep that editorial decision to just simply, not people who are writing, when they are writing in reports, white Jews. That's a choice. And this is why I say there may be, but I do not know of any any Palestinians, any Syrians, any Lebanese, anybody from the Middle East at all. I do not hear them saying, we white Arabs. I speak as a white Arab. So there is an apologetic that has nothing to do with what comes from outside. It is something which is inside. There are Jews who are of Ashkenazi background who nevertheless will say, I am a Jew. I am not German. I am a Jew. How easily, however, and that's what Baldwin picked up. The irony of assimilating into white America meant assimilating into something that was foreign to being Jewish as a member of a people who are then diverse, just as Black Americans in color are very diverse. And depending on what you look like, you do have access to privilege, which is a different conversation. I am only arguing that by allowing students that, we both teach, so in the classroom, we can undo some of the damage that is done by insisting on whiteness. And I have found a few young people who actually insist on saying, but I am white, as if to take it away is to take away a privilege. And I do have two pieces of that, one that ISGAP published and one that recently appeared in the Forward regarding the suffragette movement. And, are the women who are identified as Jewish, did they act as Jews or did they act as white women? And it's not the same.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Nafras, would you like to say something to wrap this up? I know that you've been one of the last to elaborate conclusions, but anything else?
Whiteness has been, aspiration for whiteness has been shared by a number of communities in India during the British Raj. And the Baghdadi Jews in India seem to be competing with the Armenians to be recognized as whites by the British. And it is because of this aspiration of theirs that they very consciously try to distance themselves from the already resident older Jewish communities in India, the Ben Israel and the Kochini, who were just as dark-skinned as the rest of the Indian population. So whiteness recognition as Europeans brought about a number of privileges, and they also felt that if they succeeded in getting recognized as whites, they could escape the racist element in the British Raj, the British racism.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I think I agree with all of you in the terms that sometimes this whiteness that we talk about is also a construct, and it is a condition sine qua non to be a modern person. I see that, for example, in Mexico, when some Jewish friends, mostly secular, say and complain that when they return to Mexico, they are asked, where are you from? I'm Mexican. They show the Mexican passport. But again, the question, but originally, where are you from? Who you really are? That also happens to any other type of person who looks white. Beginning with the assumption in the outside Mexican borders that there's no white people in Mexico. So that is problematic because there's a lot of them and they feel really Mexican, and this bi-directional effect of exclusion works not only for those who look backward, but also for those who look foreign, right? Meaning white. So that doesn't allow, you know, unity without the hierarchies. And like I said, it's a complex, abstract way of analyzing this type of difference, but it is really practical for many people to start categorizing the other. That said, that's what I wanted to include, some of these pictures that show Mexico as a modern place. Several Mexican theorists have argued that modernity in Mexico started with the colonial times, and then with the participation in things such as positivism, and then subsequent schools of thought. However, it's difficult to think ourselves as true integrants of modernity. And that is what we feel in the street. That is what we feel in regards comments from people coming outside of Mexico. So that would be probably my conclusion to the answer of appearance, ethnicity, this contemporary requirement to be part of a modern society, etc. Do we have any other questions from the chat?
Not so much questions, other than a bit of a debate or discussion about the categories allowed to assign to yourself in the U.S. Census and some of the politics associated with that. And there's definitely a lot of politics to that. I know, I think that Dr. Meverock would like to talk to that.
Yeah, just very briefly, because people don't understand the census because they don't read the census. They just receive it, they answer it, they send it back. I actually do teach about the census, and I include it in 2 classes. One I teach with a microbiologist. So the American census debate over race categories, they don't start out as race categories. They start out as free and slave. As time passes, the census categories change. If anyone wants to think academically or speak about the census, it's not difficult. You just go in and you read the census categories over time, and you'll find that they change. The current categories, and it is a big deal, the current categories, race categories specifically is what they're called. Ethnicity, one is either Latino or not Latino. Those are the 2 ethnic categories. They have nothing to do with sociological understandings of ethnicity. They arose because of a need to have a number. Why have any racial categories at all? For those who are trying to monitor this is the language, monitor the implementation of anti-discrimination legislation. If you don't have numbers, you can't know whether this group of people have been discriminated against when they apply for mortgages compared to the other group. So there's a debate whether to keep it or not. Canada does have an ethnic category and a religious category. Jews in Canada can choose either or. France has no racial categories since World War II, knowing that the Nazis built themselves around race. So the census is not a good example for how people self-identify. The fact is, when my daughter walks down the street, she looks white. People assume she's white unless she corrects them, which she always does. The whiteness that I think we're talking of, and I think this also derails conversations just about Jews as a people, no adjective. The adjective is what should be identified and defined. But the moment we slip into focusing our attention on whiteness, we're talking about privilege and power. But it gets us away from talking about Jews as a multicultural, multilinguistic group of people, Jews as a people. And I think that the challenge for getting away from the juxtaposition of racism and anti-Semitism is to keep coming back to, we're not talking about which Jews are Ashkenazi, which Jews are Mizrahi. Those become the corollary questions. starting point, the very starting point should be Jews as a people. And then we can go into the hierarchies, but not the reverse. Oh, by the way, Americans think Jewishness begins with the Shoah. Jewishness does not begin with the Shoah. Jewishness maybe begins with Abraham. And if we were to argue that, then we have Isaac and Ishmael. And if we have Isaac and Ishmael, which people don't know, and I always, I like to push that. 2 times those children came together, twice. All of us have had a partner at some point. Some of us have had children, some of us have divorced. So they're two parents, right? 1 father, 2 sons. They come together to bury him. Now, whether Abraham was real or not doesn't matter, but the fact is that where he's supposed to be buried, where he probably is not, is a point of contention, and that is Hebron. So where we start is where we can move. If we start always with whiteness, we're stuck in that. And I don't know how we can get out of that loop without moving away from it.
To piggyback off of one of the comments that you made during that talk, one of the chat, I would have to scroll too far back to say it exactly, so I'll paraphrase, but one of our participants that's here from Turkey made a comment about what white means there. And she said that white isn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, she said that white isn't referring to your race, it's talking about the fact that you're wealthy and privileged. Yes, she's nodding yes, so I paraphrased her correctly.
Yes, to reinforce that idea, I could say that in some parts of Mexico and Latin America, I would be white. But some people in other countries look at me in terror when I say that I could be white, right? And they need to reinforce the notion that I'm not, and that anyone thinking that I am is not well. So there we go again with that issue of how self-identifying is important.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am looking at the time, and I want to be mindful of the fact that we have gone over a bit of what we asked people to give to us of their time. So I hope everyone will join me in thanking everyone that came and participated, and I hope that you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Katia, Amy, and Nafras. I really appreciate your help. You were great. Thank you.
Bye, Freda. Good luck on your move.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Emanuel, gracias por estar aquí.